My name's Henry Park. I'm executive partner at PandoBlocks and CEO of 3GC Group. We've been around for 20 years. So last year was our 20-year anniversary. We've been servicing IT and information systems operations. I split them up purposely because a lot of various different industries look at IT and IS differently. But we've been servicing both IT and IS operations with our CXO-led consulting and managed services for 20 years now. We're now building the first ever fully managed data warehouse system and data help desk services geared for pre-ERP business intelligence. And it's going to be at a fraction of the price of what it costs and time for implementing an ERP system. So why are we doing this webinar today? Well, those of us who've played a C-level role, and all of us here in some context played a C-level role, whether in operations or technology, doesn't matter. We'd rather implement technology the right way instead of coming into fixing a broken system. I think all of us sort of had that experience. For PandoBlocks, we've made a living out of it. After fixing dozens, hundreds almost of broken ERP implementations, we figured out that the missing component to successful implementations is making sure that the processes are in place before the technology gets in there, right? So one of the core foundational infrastructure that supports any CPG company is S&OP, or Sales and Operations Planning. And one of the foundational keys to this infrastructure are the business processes. So you have to design the systems around the people and process, but most vendors are happy to just install the systems before the processes are formed. So sales forecasting process is where S&OP starts. And if you don't get this right, you'll get the classic garbage in, garbage out problem, right? And everyone is so familiar with it if you've gone in and went to fix a broken implementation. So this is going to be the first of a series that we're going to do. Eventually, we're going to get into demand planning, which is more of an enterprise view of taking forecasting and S&OP to that next level. We're going to eventually get to demand planning, but we're going to start with sales forecasting first. John, do you mind going into why we're going to start off with that?
Sure, absolutely. Let me give you a quick introduction to myself. My name is John Willard, and I currently work for a consulting firm in Los Angeles called 80/20 Consulting. We've been around for about 10 years. We have about 120 professionals, and we help companies with accounting and finance needs through all stages of company growth. We have deep expertise in the food, manufacturing, and CPG space. My background is I'm a CPA with over 25 years of experience in roles such as CFO, Chief Operating Officer, Controller, with a large part of my career spent in the food and CPG space, particularly around profitability improvement, M&A support. Some of my recent work has been with Bolthouse Farms, Chosen Foods, Wetzel Pretzels, and a number of other startups. I realize there's a varying degree of probably expertise on this call, but I'd like to take a minute just to explain what S&OP planning is. S&OP, as Henry says, stands for Sales and Operations Planning. It's simply, and I use the word, it's not simple, but simply it's creating a sales forecast for your products, then organizing your operations to meet the sales demand, which includes making decisions on your supply chain, your inventory levels, and the amount of labor that will be needed in order to produce the right amount of products at the right time and having them at the right locations for your customers. Why is it important? Basically, your whole business economic model will be determined by your ability to efficiently plan and produce and have your products to your customers, where they need it and when. So if you don't have a good S&OP process, you'll incur losses, you'll burn excess cash, you may ultimately be unsuccessful with your business. Having too much inventory due to bad planning ties up working capital. Having too little inventory will lead to lost sales opportunities, higher unit costs, and inefficiencies. All the actions and steps within SOP are important, but if you don't get the S right, everything downstream from that will be off. You could have a world-class supply chain, you could have the best manufacturing operation, but it won't matter if your sales forecast or demand plan is off. So that's why we chose to lead with sales planning. That's going to be the focus of the discussion today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know Ben's gonna be real happy with that focus. Thanks for joining, Ben. Far as that, uh, can you get into how effective sales planning and data usage in general uh, creates value for the CPG business from an exit standpoint?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that, Henry. So just quick background on myself. I'm Farzad Mooki. I'm a managing director with Kroll. Kroll is a 6,000 person firm with 30 with offices in 35 countries. I think we've got 70 offices or so. I'm based in LA and I lead our firm's food and beverage and nutrition M&A practice. And I've been doing this for about 19 years so far. And really what I do on a day-to-day basis is advise business owners on liquidity transactions. So that could be sales, majority recap, minority recap deals. Um, and so, as it relates to sales planning, demand planning, I think in general, when I work on M&A transactions, I'm typically advising the sellers. What I see is that buyers, determine the value of businesses based on, I'd say, two major buckets. One is the current strengths of the business, and two are all the opportunities with the business that the buyer can effectuate. Um, Buyers typically don't pay the sellers cash for all the opportunities that the buyers can effectuate. Those are synergies. And while we as an M&A advisor will work our butt off to try to get you value for all those synergies, it's very difficult to do that in practice. So if there's anything you could do to pull some of those opportunities into your business today, I think that's a great way to create value. So if that means having better data, being able to use that data to make better decisions, being able to have integrated operations and inventory that relate to the sales that you have, those will translate to profitability and they'll translate to lower working capital. But I think also they'll indicate that this is a really strong business that you have, and whether it's an investor or a private equity fund or a strategic buyer, we'll have a better view of your business, and that'll lead to a higher valuation for your company.
Awesome. Thanks, Farzad. So we put in the title the secret that technology vendors don't tell you. And the secret is that vendors know that these technology projects are going to fail without the processes, but they're actually trained on how to avoid the conversation about processes. And then a lot of people outside and on the buyer side, they're not aware of this. Being on the technology vendor side, a lot of our consultants, working at various different integrators, I won't name them, but have been trained. Part of their training is to learn how to avoid talking about process, because the P word will end up in a very long discussions about organizational change management. It'll derail the technology implementation. And so I've been in very funny conversations with these consultants, how they, when we talk about it, they're like, "Are you sure you want to talk about the P word, the process word?" And they've ran me down some of the trainings they've gone through. And it's very thorough, right? Very professionally done trainings on how to avoid talking about process. But as business owners and as business executives, we all know that people and process always come first. And so that's the really big dirty secret, right, in the technology world is most vendors will go into a project like this, avoid process at all costs, so that so they don't want to jeopardize the sale of the implementation. And another secret is for a lot of fast growth CPG companies that are really focused on product and growing their product. The reality is they won't have the content, right? They won't have the data to even start the process, right? And so and for a lot of technology vendors, they don't care, right? They're caring is about selling the technology. And so even if they know that the sales data isn't there, they'll be willing to sell the technology. And so what we're going to cover in part of the webinar today is the actual how to get that sales data content as part of what we're going to discuss here. So we're going to jump into the Q&A. And we're going to go over some curated questions to start. It will be about 15 minutes of that. And then we're going to open it up to open mic. If you're not asking questions, please go on mute so there's no background noise. But if you do have questions during the open mic part of it, please start off with a brief introduction of yourself, like we just did. And so, yeah, and don't worry about taking notes. We're actually going to, as a deliverable, create an FAQ out of this. We're going to, professionally document the questions and answers and send it out as notes as an FAQ to you guys at the end of next week. So we'll start with you, Pat. So how do companies go about compiling a sales forecast when they're not provided a forecast by the customer, or the customer's forecasts are unreliable?
So by way of background, my name is Pat Turpin, and my background, I was a Wall Street investment banker until I was hired away by one of our clients, Costco Wholesale. I was executive there for 10 years, helped them start and launch a number of new businesses for Costco, such as their gas station business, their services division, and even some vertically integrated food manufacturing plants. I left Costco and started a snack food brand called Pop Chips, which we built up to about a $100 million brand in North America and the UK. And after a couple of other entrepreneurial ventures, I'm now a full-time board member and advisor to food and beverage companies. So that's who I am. And to answer your question, Henry, the reality is few, if any, customers provide accurate forecasts, if they provide a forecast at all. So the company really needs to rely on historical data as a first step of developing a sales plan by SKU, by customer. There's obviously more to this, and we'll get into that shortly. But the key is the base needs to start with solid historical data.
Yeah, I could jump in for a second too on that quality historical data. I mean, many times it's just lack of, poor record keeping, lack of ownership, using poorly designed spreadsheets, having bad systems and process around that. And a lot of times it's just, smaller growth companies don't have the time to, really sit down and put together a good, tracking system, and having a full-time controller, accountant as you're emerging. And so, it's tough. And then I also see the over-reliance on historical information. So a lot of times it's, hey, we have this static sales forecast. We produced X amount over the last 6 months. It's the food industry and CPG space. It's a very fluid space. So you need to be talking to your customers. You need to be talking to your sales guys. You need to be adjusting off of that historical sales information. It's not like it's not going to change, right? So it needs to be a very fluid environment. Then also I find that companies don't get the right people in the room on a regular basis. So you need to have sales, ops, marketing, sitting in the room at some interval in time, sharing notes, updating what they're seeing in the marketplace, adjusting off of that historical baseline. And then once you decide on a new revised sales plan, making sure everybody's operating off of it. I see so many times you go around a company, you ask the warehouse and ops people what the plan is, what the sales team what the plan is, what the accounting team, 3 different sets of numbers. And so getting consensus around that plan and working to it's really important.
Awesome. John, from your experience, what are some indicators that the business is not forecasting properly? And I know there's some obvious ones. What are some of the things that you've seen that aren't so obvious?
Well, it's usually, a lot of it's obvious at times. It's inventory is the most often, indicator there's problems. I'm sure a lot of people on the call here can identify with excess inventory. It's really important to get out and walk around your warehouses and your operations and, open doors, do the white glove test, see if there's dust on stuff. People are asking for additional warehousing needs. You have really poor turn. So usually bad sales planning ends up in over purchase of inventory. But inversely, sometimes you see the lack of inventory. So, you see low fill rates, short shipments, stock outs, which are just as problematic as overstock, because then you're losing out on sales. You will be inefficient with your transportation costs. You may be sending out half pallets, half loaded, trucks or trains. It'll lead to inefficient plant operations. If you see your unit costs increasing, it's usually due to inefficiencies and that you didn't plan it out properly. So you're allocating more overhead across your units. And so, but really it's inventory. Inventory and screaming customers are the two things that you see most often.
Nice.
And
That's a good way to put it.
inventory is a use of your capital, which is as a growing business, you don't have a lot of, right? So that's an issue. But also when it comes time to sell a business, typically buyers expect that you're delivering a sufficient amount of working capital to support the business going forward. I've done a lot of deals of late, especially after COVID, where our clients have held excess inventory, and that's because of supply chain issues. But a buyer may not understand it. A buyer may think that you're not operating your business well, and so there's excess inventory, and they may expect that higher level of inventory to be what they need, not something lower. So there's almost always towards the 11th hour of a deal, a very detailed negotiation around working capital, because we as a sell on the sell side, you don't want to have to keep more inventory in the business than you need. You may want, some liquidity from what you deem excess, but it's hard to convince a buyer of that. So really having a track record of multiple months, ideally multiple years, where you can show sort of inventory turns over time and what really is needed will help you later on when you are selling your business and don't have to be viewed as having to make an investment into working capital as part of that transaction, or to leave more inventory than is what is needed going forward.
Right, great input. Pat, is there any other commonsensical stuff that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just tacking on to what John was saying on symptoms, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the swings in inventory that are increasing in magnitude are a classic symptom. What I also see a lot of is companies that have these manual processes that have kind of outgrown the complexity of the business, has outgrown their manual process. They'll start to question if certain employees that oversee those manual processes have lost a step. Bob did a great job in keeping track of inventory in the warehouse for so many years, and boy, lately he's just making a lot of mistakes. Well, when you grow from 30 to 300 SKUs, and you're have a manual process, keeping track of that inventory, your process gets overwhelmed. So generally, I like to say, don't blame the process, don't blame the person, blame the process.
Got it. Oh, really, really good stuff. Hey, Pat, what prevents companies from simply using their sales history to develop a forecast?
Generally not starting with the right data architecture and data mapping process. That can make the data unreliable or not accessible in the right format. I see this all the time. A company slams in an ERP and they think they've entered in their customer information into the ERP, but without thinking through the mapping and data architecture. So for example, a company that I know, they sell primarily through distributors. So their sales history and their system is just a handful of distributors, even though they have lots and lots of end retail customers. So the business is not run and planned at the distributor level, it's run and planned at the retailer level. But because of that mapping disconnect, the data is not super accessible or helpful. Another is how they input the data. And John touched on that briefly before. Another company, they knew they were doing roughly so much in sales with Costco, but their system just wasn't adding up to that. Well, they had entered Costco in some cases with a capital C, some cases with a lowercase c, some cases somebody misspelled Costco. So it had 4 different data records. And as ridiculous as that sounds, that's just a simple example of clean, sanitized data, as well as mapping it correctly to the customer. So you need to be able to map the data in ways that ties to your forecasting and your tracking needs.
Oh, this is a great example, and I'll shut my mouth about what AI can do in those scenarios and whatnot, so we could focus in on process. John, what are some contributing factors to a poor sales planning process?
Well, like I was saying earlier, it's really, and it's touching on what Pat just said, it's really designing out your systems, your financial reporting system, your chart of accounts, making sure you have the right revenue code set up, the right, products and SKUs in great detail. Don't be lumping product families all into one category. Make sure you have the sufficient breakout from products to SKUs so you get the granularity on what's happening. It's that communication with your customers. It's the communication amongst your team. Your sales and marketing teams should be actively participating with your finance team and your product team and your operations on what's going on. The food industry, through COVID, and there's such wild swings. Historical patterns kind of got disrupted during COVID. So if you strictly relied on your historical reporting, you would be off. The restaurant industry shut down, the grocery sector popped, food delivery, delivery via Uber and other mediums now is hot in the retail section. So it's really just keeping your pulse on the marketplace and meeting. Don't just set your annual budget for 2024, set your production schedule and go away. You need to actively be massaging that and updating on a regular basis.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Pat, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the last point John made about, having meeting on a regular basis and having the right cross-functional group to review and check that sales plan. An example is, the team scrutinizing where there could be a disconnect with a piece of the sales forecast. So, Henry, you forecasted 10,000 cases for this particular customer of that product. But the data is saying we've averaged 5,000 a month for the last several months. Why would you think they're 10,000 a month? Is it because there's some big promotion plan that wasn't communicated, or they've doubled our distribution into double the locations? Or did we just have an overly optimistic forecast on that SKU? These are things that tend to get planned out fairly far in advance, because if you're reviewing the current month, it's too late. You're generally looking at these things several months in advance so that you can order enough raw materials, you can plan enough production. But to John and Farzad's point previously, you don't want to radically over or underproduce. So the importance of these meetings and having the right cross-functional group review it on a regular basis is critical.
Okay, awesome. I have a question that is often asked of us as CIO, CTO level consultants, but I'd rather have Pat and John answer this one. And Pat, if you can start first. Can a company get a better sales planning process by implementing an ERP solution or some other off-the-shelf sales planning product?
I think it's a classic, misconception that a technology tool can solve all my problem. You touched on it earlier, Henry, that if you don't have the right processes in place, the technology isn't going to be a silver bullet. And so generally, no. The companies that I see successfully implement an ERP and are using that to help in their planning process have already taken months and months to set the right processes in place.
Yeah. John?
Yeah, agree. And I estimate 20 colleagues in this meeting. It's funny because a lot of the work we do, I'd say 75% of the work we do is coming in behind a flawed ERP implementation or some type of we were going to implement this and it didn't work. And usually I would say, 80% of probably ERP system implementations fail and don't achieve the goals they were trying to achieve. And so a lot of it is process and planning. It's not going to be an automatic solution for anyone. You should be planning 6 months to 9 months in advance of putting an ERP system in, what you want to get out of it, what's the data strategy, what is the attributes, how's the information going to flow. And a lot of times what I see is companies are just trying to replicate their current mode. Like, okay, let's get all of the reporting in the new ERP system exactly the way we do it. We have to get all the modules built out the same way we do it. And so you also have this great expensive technology tool, but you're getting the same reporting out of it. And so that's an error I see all the time. I'm not a client right now up in Sacramento that's in the healthcare space, but they manufacture and they're going through a NetSuite implementation right now. And they have a pretty out of control manufacturing process. They're actually using NetSuite's workflows and the good habits that are kind of built in NetSuite. They're using that as kind of an organizing principle to lay out their plan, their production planning, the way they're going to run the shop floors. So even though it's not a total solution, will fix everything, they're using the rally around putting NetSuite in as a opportunity to get organized. And so I like what they're doing up there.
Awesome. Great. And some of the things that from a CIO perspective, just when we're looking at how to get the actual business intelligence that the business needs to operate, you have to do the mapping of the data and figure out the relational aspects between the data and the reports, right? So, you have to understand the process and you have to understand where the data is coming from and then how to map them together. And that comes first before, shoving in any technology. So, we get asked this question a lot, and, we get a lot of weird looks in our face when we're saying this kind of answer, because they're expecting us to go sell them a technology or whatnot. But it's process always comes first. Farzad, what level of sophistication with data creation and analysis do buyers look for, M&A buyers?
Yeah, I mean, in an M&A process, it's important to be able to explain your business and do that with as much granularity as possible, because really sophisticated buyers will be looking for that. I think it also goes back to what I said before. You want to try to have that sophistication and bring those processes so that a buyer doesn't have to do that themselves and not give you credit for it. But I think what's most important around that is building on what John and Pat and even you, Henry, said was you're making sure that the data is coded correctly. So for example, I sold a business last year. They sold snacks in bulk and in packages and in retail. One of their key strengths was that they sold natural and organic products. When buyers asked them for the split of their sales between natural and organic, they couldn't tell us because they didn't code that data correctly. When they coded everything by bulk or package, they didn't enter it by the product type. So whether it was nuts or candy or seeds or grains. So buyers ask these obvious questions because they want to understand really what's driving the demand, why some of the retailers want these types of products. And it was a black box. And I think for that reason, we got them a good price, but we couldn't get them, I think, the best price that they could have gotten if they were able to answer those questions and really show that they've run their business that way. The other one is profitability. I mean, I think it's almost, I'm pleasantly surprised when a new client can tell me their profitability by SKU or by customer or by channel. It's just something that no one does. And I understand it's because, like Pat said, if you're selling through UNFI, you don't always get the granularity of data around what's happening in retail. If you're selling through UNFI, they're hitting you with multiple chargebacks, and you got to have some process in place to be able to allocate that to the specific retailer or even the specific product. Or they're not entering a bill of materials for each product. When they purchase products from a co-packer, they'll put in like a gross price, right? So those are all impediments to be able to explain to buyers, what your profitability is by channel, by customer, how that impacts the growth going forward, how that supports a forecast model, right? So really, I think it's the sophistication that you want to be able to get the highest value for your business. What the buyers are looking for, I think they're looking for that level of sophistication. They don't often see it in the middle market, but I think if you're able to produce that type of data during a process, it will lend itself to higher values that a seller could get.
Great insights. I got one more question. This one is, a lot of business owners ask this question, and this is going to be interesting. I'm sure it's going to elicit a lot of other questions. After this question, we're going to get into open mic Q&A, so you could start putting in your questions onto the chat, and I'll start picking from them. But this question is for Pat, John, and Farzad in that order. Pat, if you can answer it first. How far ahead of an M&A transaction should you start addressing this, the sales forecasting?
Well over a year, preferably two, because it takes many months to see also if it's working, from a trend line and a process standpoint, month to month, week to week, month to month. You're working through issues, but you're not really going to see from a trend line standpoint if it's actually working correctly. Is it coded correctly? Are you getting the information you really need? Are you improving your accuracy of your forecasting? That takes a while to see that trend line. And so I would say at least a year before, preferably closer to two.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see having a good S&OP process should be built into your DNA. So I think you start that not necessarily as part of an M&A process or a money raise, but I agree with Pat. You're looking at a year or two in advance of that. I always feel like if you are going to do an M&A transaction or do a money raise, you need to start preparing the diligence and the reporting and the documentation. You need to start preparing well before you start doing your road shows and talking to people, obviously. But I believe an S&OP process should be an ever evolving process. You can't be too big or too small to start it. You may not have the resources and the time initially when you're in startup, but when you start hitting 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, you're on that growth ride. You need to be thinking about SOP.
Farzad?
Yeah, I agree with that timing. I think you want to be able to make the right decisions with your business and have that translate into profitability historically, because I think that helps with valuation. I also know that entrepreneurs have day jobs, right? And this is not something that you want to be cramming and focusing on ahead of a process. Like you said, John, there's other diligence to do and other sort of levers to pull to create value as you're getting closer to that time. So yeah, starting as early as possible is important. And yeah, not having to sort of figure it out on the fly, I think is also important.
Okay, good. I see a question up there. We'll start with that one. Feel free to ask, guys, ladies. All right, so this question is for John. What can a CEO or owner of a company do if they have poor or no real accounting information to assess what's going on in their business?
Well, I suggest they call 80/20 Consulting. Are any of us on the call here? No, in seriousness, I think you know what it is. I'm a real big believer, and I work on a lot of different clients and work with different companies, is management by walking around. So I'm talking about walking out in the warehouse, talking to your receiving, talking to your shipping, talking to your operators. You could get such a feel. I could spend 2 hours in a plant and I can come back and I have a hot list of 5 things we need to work on. So if you don't have the data and you're not there yet with accounting, just get out there and walk around, ask questions. The workers will know everything. If you see a bunch of guys playing ping pong and sitting around, the labor is not humming. If you see boxes stacked in the parking lot or in shipping containers, or you got a lot of work in progress sitting in the places it shouldn't be, that is a warning sign that you need to get on top of your business.
That's an interesting one. Yeah. Here's another one. How do you compare the need for sales planning versus establishing S&OPs and KPIs? If a business owner needs to focus on one, which one should they begin with?
I'll jump in on that one. They're all relevant. It's not that one isn't. It's just you have to have the basics first, which is kind of a lot of what you've heard today and from the panelists. So, for example, S&OPs can cover a lot of things, right? Is it an S&OP for a manufacturing process or for an accounting function that goes into how you're tracking and mapping sales? Can mean a lot of things, but generally, you want to have clear operational SOPs in place and good planning. KPIs, I've seen companies that don't have good planning, and the KPIs are what I like to call an exercise in false precision. It looks great, it looks sexy, but the data that goes into those KPIs is garbage. So that means the KPI is garbage. So you got to have the building blocks first, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. What's funny about that is a lot of the ERP systems will have the KPI dashboard. It's one of the selling points, and it's part of what Henry's saying is a secret that's not that KPI dashboard that comes out of the box. It's usually worthless. I mean, it's like, oh great, I know what my current ratio is. I know, yeah, garbage in, garbage out, or it's reporting you don't need. And generally, I'm back on an Excel spreadsheet or using some other third-party solution. And KPIs are really important, and a lot of companies have too many KPIs. And so a lot of times I'm like, what are your top 3 to 5 things that are important to you? Develop that, maybe custom build it into your ERP system, but out of the box, your odds of having good analytics and KPIs is almost zero on most ERP dashboards.
I think those KPIs were designed by lawyers because lawyers are the only ones that really benefit there. And it's always like people finger pointing at each other. Hey, how come you didn't do this? That's a good question. Okay. So another question. How can I start tackling the process side with the technology I already have, since it sounds like introducing new technology might cause more short-term pain? This is one of those things, and this is part of the reason why we stay agnostic. It's really not the technology, it's always the process, it's the people, right? And what data you have first. And so, if you already have the technology in there, and you've spent a lot of money in it, I don't think you should be looking at another technology. You're just going to overcomplicate it. It's always going to be to make sure that you have the right process to get the right data and start there. And sometimes it requires you actually to go back into using some of the old systems that you had. More often than not, we see, one of the most common designs of NetSuite that we unravel is that it's designed to look just like your QuickBooks. And people don't realize, that's that until they get into the KPI modules and they realize, wait a minute, we don't have the data to get to the KPI measurements and whatnot. And so, I think this question really points back to the point of this webinar is to really make sure you get the process right. But Dave, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, just from our experience, you probably, starting with QuickBooks and going to whatever you've invested in is, unless you're getting into a multinational, multi-currency environment with very complex supply chain, people are really surprised when we go in is how powerful QuickBooks Online is. And even NetSuite or whatever ERP platform that you have, is that going in and looking at your process, looking at the way that you interact with it, really understanding that, it's much easier to utilize that investment. And I think John's probably seen this, we've seen it a whole bunch of times, is to go through and really be able to focus on process. And then there are definitely places where you will hit your head on QuickBooks, and you will know that. There are definitely places where you'll hit your head on NetSuite. But by that time, you guys were going back on the investment banker side, we hopefully all be sitting on a beach having Mai Tais somewhere, because your company is going to be so successful and so large, that it's the technology will scale much beyond what it is. And it's really the process that's going to hold you back. So I would say whatever you have in place, even if it's QuickBooks, don't believe the NetSuite guys. You're going to be able to run your business on NetSuite and really focus on the process, really understand that and pull that apart. And I think you could start that day one. You can start that today.
Yeah. We've for context, we've sold billion-dollar companies that are on QuickBooks. Like it's possible, right? And the other thing I would say is I often advise against switching ERP systems right before a transaction process. It's always something that a seller wants to do, but it's such a distraction. The data is always ruined. So it's almost like, let's figure out how to maximize what you have now. And, or you got to do it well in advance of a process. But more of it is just making sure you're getting the right data from whatever from whatever ERP you have.
Yeah.
100%.
I'm going to start probing some people. This is an interesting group because I see two different groups. One group that is, very early on in their growth and growing very quickly, and they don't have the manpower to do a lot of these processes. And then there's some people in your more established companies that are, that have the staff, but are also exploring direct to consumer or growing their direct to consumer business extremely quickly. And so, Jimmy, I know you're a subject matter expert in this, in scaling direct to consumer. Pete, you're a former CTO in the logistics space and have grown, a company to $1 billion with an exit. What are some of the things that they're going through your mind? Because this topic invites everyone, right? It's a crucial topic that every size company needs to get right, and has legitimate challenges with. The process to get the data right for this is a challenge at any size company. What have you guys seen in the direct to consumer space, or companies that are scaling really quickly in the internet? What do you guys see as challenges in tying in sales planning to operations?
I'll pose a question, Henry, because as he mentioned, lifelong CTO guy. So often I've had the responsibility for purchasing systems, often not systems that me or my team will use. Like I think the SNOP is a perfect example. So for the guys in the room who are the experts, how does someone loop in, like whose throat is the right one to choke to make sure you get that process up front? Like, where do you guys usually find that? Because I can say as a CTO, I can't tell you how many times I've been tasked with spending, $1 million on some system that I'm not going to use, right? That's an accident waiting to happen. So what do you guys think?
I'll jump in real quick. The requirement setting process and having the multiple disciplines within a company, like I like to get like a task force together, say, okay, we're going to do an ERP system. What are the requirements? Get the operators, get the sales guys, get the finance guys, get the procurement, whatever it is, and say, here's what we need, and make sure that, it's all addressed. And we come up with a really good RFP document requirements, and well in advance of the decision, as we're evaluating solutions, I'd partner up with a firm that's going to help us bridge, our requirements into the best outcome, versus just like, oh, I went to a seminar and I heard like we should be in great, Microsoft Dynamics, let's just do it. There really needs to be that requirement setting group task force that's leading the charge, making sure everything's addressed, everybody is getting what they need out of it.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I haven't, Pete, seen as many of those implementations as the 80/20 group has. But the ones that I've seen succeed, it's generally not one throat that's choked. To John's point, it requires a cross-functional team. I've seen usually it involves a quarterback, but the quarterback relies on that cross-functional team, or else critical aspects of the process get left out and then things fail. That's just what I've seen.
I'll just throw out one point, and I think that this is what we're seeing. And I'm going to go back to the earlier conversation where for a small growth company, the option to be able to eat the elephant one bite at a time. So, for example, we talked a lot about the importance of inventory management, really, for your sales forecasting, making sure that that data is correct. And there are that are different parts of the company as they're your companies are starting to grow. The option for also being able to look at really point solutions, and this is again making sure you have good processes into place. But so, for example, there's a lot of really good focused small business inventory management systems like Fishbowl. And it may be just important rather than going through and putting together the cross-functional team is basically, you guys making a decision. I need to solve this problem first, right? Inventory management is my number one problem. And that can be a lot less distracting and a lot more focused because you're only going to be implementing a new system and touching the departments and the groups and the people that are going to be using that. Whereas these bigger ERP, when you're doing a NetSuite or an Oracle or a Dynamics, you're kind of throwing your entire company up in the air, right? Everybody's got to get on board of that. And I just wanted to throw that out as an alternatives perspective is, being, like I said, taking the problem, the big problem that's in front of you. It may be project lifecycle management, right? So as you're doing a design side of it, or it may be just basic accounting, right? Chart of accounts and AR, AP, that side of it, and really be able to focus on a really good QuickBooks implementation, online implementation around that. But it doesn't have to be a one size, I have to put in a system that's going to work for everything. That there are alternatives and advantages to being able to kind of like, let's address the specific, your biggest pain point at the time. So just throwing that as an alternative too.
This is good. Jimmy, was there anything you wanted to, my question was more on direct to consumer and how that translates into sales forecasting issues and translating that into the operation. What are some of the most common issues that you see during that handoff?
Yeah, that's a good question. What jumps off directly in my experience, most of the consumer brands that I've worked for and that we've provided advisory to, right? Like they work with vendors that pretty much package everything, right? So I compare this to my experience starting a fresh food delivery company where we got really granular, right? We bought the ingredients. So we had, luckily where I was at, my friend's his parents owned Valley Fine Foods, which was a mid-market food company, and they had ERPs to manage that. So, but I can only imagine how granular we need to get in terms of understanding the cost. Whereas most of the clients that we work with and brands I've been with, right, the vendor abstracts all of that away. At the end of the day, it's just an invoice and an MOQ for this SKU, right? And pretty much you could get to like 20 million or even like 50 million with QuickBooks, basically, right? And you're just managing POs and like, okay, here's the minimum amount of orders. And then the vendor would just take care of all the more granular stuff, all the details of the ingredients, the materials that that they need to purchase to create the product itself, right? But from a data perspective, I think once you have the right data, at Third Love, when I got there, their thinking was very much like, let's just create another Victoria's Secret, right? Focus on at that point, that type of the model image that the culture accepted, right? And then their own differentiation was, okay, we're going to do half cups. But we hooked up server-side event data, and what we eventually did was, instead of carrying SKUs of larger bands, larger cups, we just put it on to the store, and we made a decision to let people check out and simply just tell them that we don't have it, ran out of stock. But because of we're able to track the demand for it, we got into bigger bands, bigger SKUs, and that informed inventory, right? Okay, let's invest more in this. Eventually that changed the company's outlook on how it projects itself, right? Instead of being a copy of Victoria's Secret, now it's, hey, we could compete on this inclusivity, right? So I think, and show more, women with different body types. So I think with the right data, you could certainly have a lot of impact across not just how you run growth, or right, it could influence how you do your brand messaging and inventory planning, right? And ultimately, we leverage a lot of that data to become smarter with inventory planning, right? We leverage that to help us understand what are the open to buy amounts for different SKUs, right? And make bets on SKUs that we didn't supply, but then we put it on the site so that we could kind of see demand by just people clicking. And a lot of that came through customer service, right? It really started there, where we're mining customer service for sentiment, but also for requests like, do you have larger bands? Do you have larger cups? Right. And I think altogether it's not just the quantitative, it's also the qualitative data that we took a look at. But yeah, I mean, that's been my experience. And I've seen other brands leverage the DTC channel as a way, not necessarily to drive profits, but as a marketing channel or a test channel. I think Ugly Drinks, I mean, they went under, but they use their DTC channel to really understand consumer taste, right? So they will put out, pretty unique flavors, and if it did well, they will carry that data to the retail stores and have them carry those SKUs, right? If they're able to sell into that. So
very cool, very cool. All right, well, we have let's try to wrap up a little sooner. Is there any last questions from the group? Any questions? A good question. It's a lot of brain trust here. All right, well.
I got a quick question for, this is more on the M&A side for Farzad and Pat. In your recent deals, I mean, what are you seeing in terms of the distribution between like D2C and retail or wholesale strategy, right? Like, what is getting the higher valuation?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, the focus with a lot of buyers of late has been around profitability. So if you could do D2C profitable, I think that's a strength. But I think because acquisition costs are getting higher, that's more challenging. And then you're also seeing consumers come back to stores. It depends on the category. There's still certain categories that are heavily D2C, like personal care and supplements. But for food and beverage and other categories, buyers are looking for a proof of concept in retail. So I think not forgetting retail is going to be important. So I see there being more interest there and more robust valuations there than maybe more digitally native D2C focused type companies right now.
It's a good question.
What I would say, Jimmy, is it's not so much is there more or less of one or the other, is there's distinct buyers for both. But to Farzad's point, the key difference is profitability is more important than ever. Mm-hmm. And that's consistent with both. On the D2C side, it's harder and harder for companies to kind of meet those profitability metrics that they used to make a few years ago. But if you can, there's buyers there. It's not like they're distinct and different buyers. So I see brands that start D2C and go to retail, and brands that launch in retail and bring on D2C. I see both. And it's more a question of, if you're successful and profitable, there's buyers for both.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you all for participating. This will be a series, so we'll do the next one around S&OP. And we'll eventually get to demand planning. Jimmy, would love to get you to be a part of that demand planning session. I think you have a lot of rich information there. Until next time, we'll be sending the FAQ over to you guys by the end of next week. I really appreciate everyone's questions and participation. Until next time, thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.